Hey, my name's Giola, and I've got a story that still keeps me up at night, even though it didn't happen to me. This one comes from my father, who told me bits and pieces of it over the years, usually when he'd had a little too much to drink or on nights when insomnia got the better of him. It's something that's haunted him ever since it happened, and I guess now it haunts me too. You'll understand why soon. It was the summer of 1971. My father was just 15, maybe 16, he wasn't exactly sure anymore. And like a lot of kids back then, he had this rebellious streak. Life at home wasn't great, not that he ever liked to talk about it much. His parents were distant, cold, the kind who wouldn't notice if their son disappeared for a whole summer. That's exactly what he did. Armed with nothing more than a backpack, a few dollars, and that teenage invincibility, my dad decided he'd take off and spend the summer hitchhiking around the northeast part of Quebec. Back in those days, hitchhiking was just a way to get around. No one thought twice about sticking out their thumb and climbing into a stranger's car. If he'd known then what he knows now, I doubt he would have even considered it. He met all sorts of people on the road, truckers, drifters, families on vacation, even a few college kids who'd taken the summer off to find themselves in nature or whatever. It was the early 70s after all. Everyone was either running from something or trying to chase down some kind of freedom. My dad fit right in with that crowd, but all that changed one afternoon when he accepted a ride from a group of Americans heading in the same direction. He couldn't recall exactly how many of them there were, maybe 3, maybe 4, but he remembered the driver distinctly. He had these piercing blue eyes, the kind that seemed to see right through you, and a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. His name might have been Jim or something like that, but it doesn't really matter. What mattered was the feeling my dad got when he climbed into the back seat of that car. You ever get that feeling when something's just off? Like the air around you feels thick, and you can sense the tension even if no one's saying anything? That's what hit my father as soon as the door clicked shut. But he didn't have much of a choice. He was miles from the next town, and his options were limited. So he did what he always did in uncomfortable situations. He kept his head down, played along, and hoped for the best. At first, the ride wasn't too bad. The Americans were heading up north, apparently looking for some isolated spot in the woods to camp out. My dad figured they were just a bunch of guys looking to get away from the world for a bit. They talked about the war, Vietnam, I mean. And that's when my dad started to get the sense that these weren't just your average campers. He couldn't tell if they were draft dodgers, vets, or just people messed up by the world. But there was something unstable about them. It became clearer as they drove deeper into the wilderness. The further they got from civilization, the more uneasy my father became. He noticed the way they talked, the things they laughed about. It wasn't just regular road trip banter. There was a darkness underneath their words, something twisted. But my dad didn't say anything. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. The best thing to do in a situation like that, he figured, was to stay quiet and wait for an opportunity to slip away. They eventually reached a campground in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't some family-friendly park with neatly marked trails and fire pits. It was a ramshackle place, more like an abandoned lot where drifters and outlaws came to crash for the night. The kind of place where no one asked questions and no one kept track of who came and went. It was perfect for people like the Americans. Not so much for my dad. They set up camp, pulling out tents and gear from the back of the car. My dad helped out, trying to act normal even though every instinct in him was screaming to run. But where would he go? The sun was setting, and the nearest town had to be at least 50 miles away. Besides, he wasn't sure if these guys would let him leave even if he tried, so he stuck around, blending in as much as possible. That night, while they were drinking and smoking around the fire, a ranger showed up. He was a tall guy, mid-30s maybe, wearing the typical forest ranger uniform. He looked out of place, too clean-cut for the rough crowd that had gathered there. The ranger started talking to the group, asking about campsite fees. Apparently, they hadn't paid, and the ranger wasn't about to let them stay without coughing up some cash. What happened next still gives me chills. The Americans didn't take kindly to the ranger's request. At first, they just brushed him off, but when he persisted, things escalated. My dad watched as their demeanor shifted. Their casual smiles turned into something else, something darker. They started mocking the ranger, taunting him, and one of them even grabbed a rifle from their car, holding it up as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" The ranger, to his credit, didn't back down right away. He kept pressing, telling them they needed to either pay up or leave. But then the Americans started laughing, a low, menacing kind of laugh that made the hair on my father's neck stand up. They weren't going to pay. They weren't going to leave. They were planning something else. After the ranger finally walked off, saying he'd be back in the morning, the Americans huddled together, whispering and chuckling in that sinister way. My dad pretended not to notice, but he overheard enough. They were talking about killing the ranger. It wasn't just idle talk. These guys were serious. They figured it would be easier to shoot the ranger than deal with him hassling them about fees. My dad's stomach twisted in knots as he listened to their plan. They had rifles, at least 2, and they were ready to use them. Here's where my dad showed a kind of bravery I can't even begin to imagine. He didn't freak out. He didn't panic. He waited for the right moment, keeping his cool the whole time. The next morning, when the ranger returned, my dad approached him before the Americans could make their move. He pulled the ranger aside, trying to sound casual, but with enough urgency that the ranger would understand. My dad didn't come right out and say, "They're planning to kill you," but he hinted at it strongly enough that the ranger got the message. My father offered to pay the fee himself, even though he barely had any money left, just to get the ranger out of there. The ranger, realizing something was seriously wrong, took the push and left without another word. You'd think my dad would have left with the ranger, right? But no, he stayed. I asked him about that once, why he didn't just get out of there as soon as he warned the ranger. He said it wasn't that simple. He couldn't just up and leave without raising suspicion. If the Americans thought for a second that he was turning on them, they'd turn on him. So he stuck around for a couple more days, waiting for the right moment to slip away. Those 2 days must have been the longest of his life. He said every time the Americans laughed or made a joke, he wondered if they were planning to turn on him next. He barely slept, keeping one eye open the entire time. They didn't talk about the ranger after that morning, but my dad knew they hadn't forgotten. They were just waiting for the right opportunity to strike. At one point, one of the guys asked my dad if he knew how to shoot. My dad played dumb, saying he didn't know much about guns. The guy just grinned and said, "Well, you'll learn soon enough." My dad laughed along, but inside he was terrified. He knew they were testing him, seeing if he was part of their twisted little group or just some kid they could dispose of when they were done. On the 3rd day, they made a stop in a small town to pick up supplies. My dad saw his chance. As soon as the Americans were distracted, he grabbed his backpack and slipped away into the crowd. He didn't look back. He didn't stop until he was miles away from that town, hitching a ride from an elderly couple heading in the opposite direction. He never saw those men again. I can't imagine what was going through his mind during that ride away from the campground. Relief, probably. Fear, definitely. But also guilt. He never said it outright, but I think part of him felt guilty for not doing more, for not going to the police, for not trying to stop those men. But what could he have done? He was just a kid, alone in the wilderness with a group of armed, dangerous men. Years later, when he told me the story, he said the scariest part wasn't even the moment he realized the Americans were planning to kill the ranger. It wasn't the guns or the threats or the way they laughed like it was all some sick joke. No, the scariest part was how normal they seemed at first, how easily he could have missed the signs if he hadn't been paying attention. That's what's always stuck with me. The idea that evil doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it creeps up on you, disguised as something harmless, something ordinary. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. My dad survived that summer, but it changed him. He never hitchhiked again. He never trusted strangers the same way again. And he carried that story with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected places. As for me, I don't think I'll ever hitchhike. Not after hearing that. Not after knowing how close my dad came to becoming another statistic, another body lost in the wilderness.